June 15, 1944. An orchard near Caen, Normandy. A British infantryman named Private Thomas Wheeler crouches behind the remains of a stone wall, a peculiar contraption resting against his shoulder. It looks almost ridiculous. A crude, skeletal framework of metal tubes and springs, more like an agricultural implement than a weapon of war. The device weighs 43 pounds. It has already jammed twice today. Every soldier who sees it tends to either laugh or curse, usually both. But in the next few seconds, as 3 German Panther tanks rumble down the narrow lane towards his position, Wheeler is about to prove something the Army's ordnance experts never quite believed: that sometimes the most unlikely idea becomes the most devastating. He squeezes the trigger. The sound is almost comical, a violent metallic thwack rather than the crisp bark of a rifle shot. The weapon recoils so viciously that it throws him backwards onto his haunches. But the shaped charge warhead, a seemingly impossible concept that combines physics and chemistry in ways that seemed pure fantasy just 5 years earlier, tears through the armor of the lead Panther as if the steel were tissue paper. The tank shudders, smoke pours from every hatch and viewport, and it stops dead. The soldiers inside are already dead or dying. This is the story of the PIAT, the projector, infantry, anti-tank, a weapon so impractical that it should never have worked, so dangerous to its operator that soldiers nicknamed it the Bombard, or worse, so complicated that half the battalion never understood how to use it properly. Yet by war's end, British infantry armed with this odd contraption had destroyed more German armored vehicles than any other anti-tank gun in the British arsenal. It is a story about how desperation breeds innovation, how sometimes the worst ideas become the best solutions, and how a weapon that seemed to defy all the rules of sensible military design became one of the most feared instruments in the hands of determined men. The problem in 1940 was existential. The German panzers, particularly the Panzer III and IV variants, were sweeping across Europe with an armor protection that made every conventional British anti-tank weapon look like a child's toy. The standard Boys .55 caliber anti-tank rifle, which had seemed adequate against the lighter armored vehicles of 1940, now bounced ineffectually off German steel. The standard 2-pounder gun could penetrate German armor only at extremely close range, well within the lethal radius of the tank's own weapons. The British Army found itself with an impossible tactical challenge. Infantry units needed a portable, man-portable weapon that could reliably defeat modern tank armor from a reasonable distance, yet nothing existed that could do this. The Americans were struggling with the same problem. So were the Germans, though they solved it rather differently. The mathematics of armor penetration had seemed immutable. To punch through modern tank steel, a projectile needed either tremendous velocity, which required heavy guns and enormous amounts of explosive propellant, or tremendous weight. The standard anti-tank guns weighed between 500 and 600 pounds and required teams to operate. They were utterly immobile compared to tanks. A tank commander could simply detect the gun's position and maneuver to attack it from a flank or rear. The British Army needed something different, something radical. They needed a weapon that weighed so little that a single soldier could carry it, fire it, and move with it, yet possessed penetrating power that seemed physically impossible to achieve with such a light package. The answer came from an understanding of shaped charges, the focused detonation of explosive force. Rather than pushing a heavy metal projectile through armor by brute force, a shaped charge works by concentrating the detonation into an impossibly hot, impossibly dense jet of molten metal that punches through steel with almost surgical precision. The technology had been developed in Germany in the 1930s and was being independently researched in Britain. By 1942, the British Army had grasped the fundamental principle. You could create a warhead no bigger than a large melon that would penetrate armor that was inches thick. The challenge was delivering that warhead accurately to a target moving at 40 miles per hour across rough terrain. The solution came from Lieutenant Colonel Millis Jeffers and his team at the Special Operations Executive's Experimental Weapons Research Facility near Welwyn in Hertfordshire. Jeffers was a man who believed that unconventional problems demanded unconventional solutions. He had already designed several improvised anti-tank weapons, including the sticky bomb, a weapon so dangerous to its user that it was eventually withdrawn from service. But the PIAT represented his most ambitious work. The fundamental concept was this: instead of using conventional gunpowder to propel the warhead, use the warhead's own shaped charge detonation. Fire the projectile with a small propellant charge that accelerated it to approximately 450 feet per second. The warhead would strike the target, and the impact fuse would trigger the shaped charge. The shaped charge itself would be powerful enough that the pressure wave it created would operate a recoil mechanism that would automatically recock the weapon for the next shot. In theory, a single soldier could fire multiple shots without manually operating a bolt or lever. It was elegant, efficient, and completely untested. The weapon consisted of a steel tube approximately 3 feet long mounted on a wooden buttstock fitted with springs and a recoil damper. The entire assembly was crude in appearance, looking more like something a Victorian engineer might have designed than a modern military weapon. The mechanical action was far more complicated than anything in conventional firearms. When the shaped charge detonated on impact, it created a pressure impulse that drove the recoil tube backwards against heavy springs. This recoil motion automatically opened the breech, ejected the spent warhead casing, cocked the firing mechanism, and chambered a fresh round. All of this had to happen in milliseconds and work repeatedly without failure. The engineering tolerance required for the springs, dampers, and mechanical linkages was extraordinarily tight. Manufacturing the weapon presented nightmarish problems. The PIAT's action relied on precise mechanical synchronization. Too much spring tension and the recoil mechanism would jam. Too little and the weapon would not properly cycle. The shaped charge warheads had to be manufactured to exact specifications. Any variation in the shape or composition of the explosive could degrade performance catastrophically. The weapons were produced at the Birmingham Small Arms Factory and several subcontractors, with each weapon requiring approximately 240 minutes of highly skilled assembly work. By the end of 1943, production had reached only a few hundred units monthly. The Army could never manufacture enough PIATs to equip every infantry unit. Allocation became political, and many unit commanders who had not actually seen the weapon in action dismissed it as an unreliable curiosity. The operational deployment of the PIAT began in 1943 with trials and training, but the weapon saw its first sustained combat use during the Sicily campaign in July 1943 and more extensively during the Italian campaign. British infantry faced German tanks defending prepared positions, and the PIAT, for all its faults, offered something irreplaceable. It gave the ordinary infantryman genuine anti-tank capability. A single soldier with training could, from a distance of 75 yards or more, inflict catastrophic damage on a tank costing hundreds of thousands of pounds and months of manufacturing time. The accounts from soldiers who used the PIAT in Sicily and Italy reveal a weapon that was simultaneously respected and despised. The mechanical complexity meant that stoppages occurred regularly, usually at the worst possible moments. The recoil was vicious. Experienced operators knew to brace themselves extremely carefully or risk broken ribs or dislocated shoulders. Training was essential, and many soldiers went into combat with minimal instruction. Yet, where commanders understood the weapon and used it correctly, the results were undeniable. In the Sicilian campaign, PIAT teams with the 8th Army accounted for at least 43 German and Italian tanks and anti-tank guns. In Italy, the numbers were higher still. A single operator named Lance Corporal Mark Devlin, serving with the 2nd Hampshire Regiment in 1944, was credited with destroying 8 German tanks and armored vehicles using nothing but a PIAT and extraordinary courage, or perhaps foolhardiness. The weapon demonstrated particular effectiveness in the bocage country of Normandy in summer 1944. The dense hedge-lined fields played to the Piat's strengths and the Germans' weaknesses. Tank commanders operating in this terrain could not see far, could not maneuver quickly, and found themselves forced into predictable lanes of movement. An infantryman hidden in a hedgerow with a PIAT had excellent tactical advantage. British intelligence reports from the Normandy campaign note that German tank crews developed a measurable fear of bocage operations, knowing that every hedgerow might conceal PIAT teams. This psychological effect was perhaps as important as the weapon's mechanical effect. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans attempted to develop anti-tank weapons using similar principles to the PIAT. The Panzerfaust, which emerged in late 1943, used a shaped charge warhead of greater power than the PEIAT, but was reloadable rather than self-recoiling. It was simpler in design and faster to produce, which explains why it eventually became the standard German anti-tank weapon. The American solution, the bazooka, used a recoilless principle but fired a rocket-propelled warhead rather than a ballistic projectile, giving it greater range but less reliability. The PIAT occupied an awkward middle ground, more effective than the bazooka at shorter ranges, more reliable than the Panzerfaust, but more complicated and more uncomfortable to use than either. The PIAT fired at approximately 450 feet per second. The Panzerfaust achieved roughly similar penetration with warheads of different design. The bazooka's rocket warhead had less kinetic energy but benefited from the rocket's guidance characteristics. The comparative statistics demonstrate the PIAT's peculiar effectiveness. A PIAT warhead weighing 2.5 pounds could penetrate approximately 3.5 inches of homogeneous steel armor at right angles. The Panzer IV's front armor was 2 inches thick. The Panther's was 3 inches at the front and 2 inches on the sides. The PIAT could defeat these vehicles reliably. The Panzerfaust could do the same or better, but required manual reloading and had a maximum effective range of only 150 yards compared to the PIAT's practical range of 350 yards in the hands of a trained operator. The American 57mm gun offered greater range and penetration but weighed approximately 900 pounds and required a crew of 5. The PIAT weighed only 43 pounds and could be operated by a single man. The PIAT influenced later anti-tank weapons design significantly. The basic principle of the shaped charge warhead with impact detonation became standard in virtually all modern anti-tank weapons. The recoil-less gun concept that the British developed in parallel with the PYAT influenced both subsequent British and American weapon design. The PIAT itself remained in service with the British Army through the 1950s, and simplified versions using basic mechanical principles rather than the original complex spring-driven recoil action remained in limited use into the early 1960s. Surviving examples can be examined at the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset and at the Imperial War Museum in London, where they appear impossibly crude to modern eyes. Return, then, to that orchard near Caen on June 15, 1944. Private Wheeler's PIAT had been considered a dubious experiment just 18 months earlier. The weapon jammed regularly, threw the operator backwards with violent recoil, required extensive training to operate at all, and looked like it belonged in a museum of failed military engineering. Yet in the hands of determined men facing an enemy with superior conventional firepower, it became something altogether different. It became the answer to an impossible question: how do you give an infantryman the power to destroy a tank? The PIAT was never elegant. It was never refined. It was never the weapon that ordnance experts had hoped to design. It was, by every conventional measure, a fundamentally flawed solution to a fundamentally impossible problem. And yet, by the war's end, British infantry equipped with PIATs had destroyed over 400 German and Italian armored vehicles, a casualty toll that exceeded that of the British anti-tank gun regiments. The weapon that seemed the dumbest idea, the most impractical, the most unlikely to work, had become indispensable. Sometimes the best solution is not the one that was supposed to work, but the one that actually does. The PIAT reminds us that sometimes, in warfare and in life, the unconventional triumph where the conventional fails. A peculiar contraption of springs and metal tubes, wielded by ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary circumstances, changed what was thought possible. It is a lesson that no amount of engineering theory can ever quite explain.